Thaumaturgy by Coco-chan and the Blue Spanch. Part 1. Out of the Unknown. The midnight wind sang through the tall grasses of the prairies of Zampidri, sending an ancient, wild music through the star-washed darkness. Lizen sat on an outcropping of stone and listened, although not to the wind. She listened to her own heartbeat, to the heartbeats of the great pack of dragons downslope of her perch, and to Modri's sleeping heart tucked up safe in the ship. And to another's who was only newly arrived to this world. Lizen turned her mind to that newcomer and smiled. Things were about to get interesting. She and Modri had spent the last several months laying groundwork for the fall of the Emperor. An uprising here, a major systems failure there, rumors for the rumor mill, opportunities for pirates, and a choice bit of spying. All to smooth the path for the greatest tools of Tahemok, her friends and allies in their great lions. It was working. She could see it. Voltron was victorious wherever it chose to fight. Other factors were lending their efforts quite independently of her own, and she welcomed them. Their strength was not infinite, however, and they had come back to Zampidri to rest. It was a comforting sort of place to herself and to Modri, and home to her pack. Tilla and Solok had needed to run with their kin again, and so had she, and Modri needed the quiet domesticity of minding the ship and feeding her whenever she came back in out of the wild. She shifted slightly on her perch, listening to the newcomer's heart. It was familiar, so it was. She'd spent a weary evening once, not so long ago, listening to an echo of it in another young heart. The newcomer was near her ship, and she tensed, touching the bone spear tipped with a serrated tambok fang, hard as a steel blade and twice as sharp. The newcomer came away without interfering with the hatches, which was wise. The Chimera Rising was from a Hanafor shipyard, and the Hanafors believed that a locked hatch should stay locked. Instead, that person cast about with senses and devices of its own, and proceeded at a steady trot in Lizen's direction. Good, she thought. Better to have this out in the open where Lizen had the advantage. If this was who Lizen thought this was, she did not want this guest inside the ship before they'd had a chance to talk. Lizen took a deep breath and picked up her spear. Not a quarterstaff this time, not out here in the wilds of Zampidri. Even the least and littlest of the predators out here would simply ignore a mere quarterstaff, or use it as a toothpick after eating its owner. Closer, closer. The newcomer was fast. Lizen opened her eyes and looked to one side, seeing 3 dots of cold, pale lavender light peering back at her from the grasses. Right. Her own heart pulsed strongly as the adrenaline hit it, and she gave her guest a feral grin before leaping away into the night. She heard the other's footsteps behind her almost immediately, and the rush of grass against body armor. What must the other think of her, she wondered as she sped away. A lean female Galra of original forest stock, dressed in nothing more than a few stitched-together Attenbach hides, barefoot and carrying a bone spear? Lizen hoped that she was baffling the creature, and was aware that she probably wasn't. Bafflement could wait until the hunt was done. Ah, yes, the hunt. There were long, eerie hoots sounding through the night air now as the dragons reacted to the chase. The pack was aware that there was a hunter in their midst. Lizen was part of this pack, and the pack was as one. The dragons knew what she knew, and accepted that she knew what she was doing. As Lizen dashed through the center of the pack, great spiny heads tossed, and deep voices bellowed. Their great hearts quickening, the dragons began to run. To its credit, their pursuer did not hesitate to follow, but matched Lizen stride for stride. Namturan, she thought. Those long legs and sinewy build adapted precisely for worlds like this one. Lizen, however, knew this prairie like the back of her hand, even in pitch darkness. They were equals in this chase, and would be equals in the following battle. The Lek was only a little further now, an ancient piece of pavement, still intact after all this time, the only remaining indicator that there had once been a civilization on this world. Lizen's toe claws clacked on stone now, and she leaped aside as a second set of clacking sounds announced her guest's presence. Lizen turned at bay to see a lavender-spotted shadow, the gleam of a long knife shining in the starlight. On the cross-piece burned the pale purple sigil, Marmora. Around them in the darkness was the thunder of clawed feet and other curious sounds. The dragons were watching. All around the Lek were the bright blue gleams of dragon eyes, from the cobalt glints of the newly mobile young to the azure glow of the elders. Breathing steady, Lizen observed the shrouded figure in silence. "Techno warrior against savage wild woman," Lizen thought with amusement. "We should have sold tickets." The blade warrior looked around itself in perplexity. Who wouldn't when surrounded by so many large predators? It raised its dark blade in salute, and then charged. Exotic alloy struck sparks from exotic bone when Lizen blocked that slash. She'd used the long leg bone of an adult Yulpadi for the shaft of her spear, and like every other large animal on this world, the substance of their bones was mind-bogglingly strong. Lizen and her foe tested each other's strength and found themselves equal. Flint-hard warrior against well-trained witch. She pushed back hard and brought the spear point around in a slash that would have gutted the blade had it not jumped back quickly enough. It attacked again immediately, jabbing the sword at shoulder and hip. Disabling strikes, aimed to cripple rather than kill. So, it wanted her alive, did it? That made sense. Lizen knew who this blade was now, and her suspicions were confirmed when it tried to pull the spear from her hands with the hook of its sword. This motion yanked Lizen closer, who was shorter and lighter than the blade was, close enough to catch its scent. Oh, yes, Lizen knew who this was. Lizen twisted free, landed a kick on the other's hip, narrowly avoided being hamstrung, and returned the sentiment with a stab that came close to impaling the blade. How long they fought, she did not know. It would have taken a lot less time if she had used her more arcane talents, but that would have been disrespectful of her opponent, and Lizen's own pride forbade her from cheating. The dragons boomed and crackled in the distance, excited by the spectacle, and great horned heads tossed and shook in the starlight. Eventually, however, the fates conspired against her. A wind-blown seed head from the grasses somehow found its way under her right foot, causing an unexpected slip. The loss of balance gave the blade the opening that it had been searching for, and Lizen's spear spiraled away into the night. A second later, Lizen was flat on her back on the stone with the blade straddling her hips, sword's edge against her throat. The sword did not complete that strike, however, because Lizen's hand was now flat against the blade's breast, and gold gleamed between her fingers as her power gripped the blade's heart. One wrong twitch, and one of them, perhaps both, would die. "Sword down, madame," Lizen said dryly. "I truly do not want to have to complete this spell." The blade hesitated, and Lizen felt her tremble. Slowly, slowly, the sword lifted away from Lizen's neck, and there was a bright gleam in the night as it shifted back into a much smaller knife. With equal care the knife was sheathed, although the blade did not otherwise move. Wise. If Lizen's hand broke contact with her chest, her heart would stop instantly and fatally. That the blade knew this was interesting. "Let me up, please," Lizen said calmly, and with great care was able to extricate herself from the warrior's grip, keeping her palm firmly planted. "Release me," the blade rasped. "Not quite yet. You will swear on your blade and your oath that you will not fight me again, nor will you strike at my ship, my man, or my friends. Swear it, I say. You're a bit excitable for my taste, and I dislike being attacked out of the blue." The blade growled under her breath, but bowed her head. "I so swear, by blade and oath, that I will not harm you or yours. Release me. Where is my son, witch?" Lizen chuckled and undid the spell, eliciting a faint gasp of relief from the blade. "He's as safe as it's possible for him to be. I need a drink, Blade. There's a small spring not too far from here, and I've got a camp set up next to it. We shall take tea and rest and talk like civilized persons." "Those creatures," the blade eyed the blue-eyed shadows warily, "will not interfere. A pair of them might want to look you over later, but they know when to keep their distance. We're quite safe." Lizen smiled at her and got to her feet, looking around for her spear. "Safer, actually, than we would be if they weren't here. Come on." Later, they were seated around a small fire with a kettle coming to a boil above it. Lizen handed the blade her spare cup and dug a packet of dried hantik leaf out of her cache. Hantik tea would calm her guest and ease the aches they'd acquired during their struggle. When she turned back, the blade had removed her mask, showing Lizen a familiar face. It was no wonder that Keith's father had wooed this one. Namtur and Galra were famous for their beauty. Even weary from a stiff fight, she was lovely. Lizen dropped the packet into the kettle, smiling at the sweet scent that wafted up almost immediately. "I will not ask you your name," she said quietly. "I'm aware of how much your group prizes its secrets. I am Lizen, if you hadn't known that already." The blade nodded. "A rogue witch of considerable notoriety. You worry Zarkon's generals greatly. I am surprised to find you running about in the wildlands like something out of our prehistory." "One should never do anything that the enemy expects one to. Besides, I enjoy it." Lizen grinned at her, showing sharp teeth. "It is wonderful at times to revert to type where no one will point and scold. My uncles would have mass apoplexy if they knew what I was doing right now, and my mother would explode." "I've met them," the blade said darkly. "I believe you." Lizen's eyebrows rose. How much of the house did they have to rebuild after that little visit? The blade snorted in amusement and held out her cup for tea. "Only a few rooms. You are very difficult to find, Lizen. Your family knew nothing of your movements, and you leave little in the way of tracks." "Considering my declaration of Kreschweg, dear, it's only sensible to be discreet. My family and I aren't on the best of terms in any case. Is your search sanctioned?" The blade blew fragrant steam from her cup. "No, I have been on field assignments for years. It's what I'm best at. My son, Lizen. Where is Keith?" Lizen poured herself a cup and sat down on a handy rock. "Piloting the Red Lion, last I knew. Your boy's a hero, Blade, and he's good at it." The blade nearly dropped her cup. "Voltron? He's a paladin? I had not—" Lizen held up a hand. "When was the last time you checked in with home base?" Keith's mother growled, glaring at the fire. "I have not made contact with my colleagues in more than a year. I was discovered at my post and have been evading capture since. When you found me and had my son, I thought—" Her voice trembled, and Lizen's heart ached in sympathy. "I understand. I would have offered more information, but you cut the connection before I could speak. He is my friend and ally, and my adoptive nephew. He asked me to find you, adoptive sister, for his father had died some years ago. I know no more of the matter than that." The blade shuddered, her face a mask of old pain and new loss. I could not stay. Gods. You have, I assume, a way to contact him? Lizen nodded and sipped at her tea. I do. He'll be delighted to speak with you. It'll have to wait until morning, however. The communicator's inside the ship, and the ship is locked. Her companion stared at her in disbelief. You do not have a key? Lizen grinned at her. Drink your tea. I felt you coming, dear, and left it in the safe box before going out. I've a ship and a mate to protect. No way was I going to make either in any way available to you. Keith's mother vented a low and rueful laugh, and drank. Wise. If we must wait until dawn, then we must. Tell me what has been going on, Lizen. How did you meet my son? Lizen chuckled. I actually came into that mess rather late. The root of it begins on the moon of Kerberos, in the Earth system. Modri was a little surprised at what followed his lady home the following morning, but he bowed respectfully and offered breakfast anyway, replenishing the platters as the two women slaked a powerful hunger, then saw to it that they both had a comfortable place to sleep. He didn't have to be told who their guest was. He could see the family resemblance between her and Keith clearly, and resolved to be patient. It was never wise to rush a blade of marmora. Instead, he ventured outside to where Tilla and Soluk were lounging in the sun. They looked like they had had a long night as well. He sat down between them, feeling the welcome warmth of the early morning sun on his body. Lizen had done a magnificent job of rebuilding him, but he still ached a little in the mornings. Tilla whiffled a soft greeting and nuzzled his shoulder gently, and he patted her nose. I see that certain things are starting to come together, he murmured. Was it a fine fight? Soluk bobbed his head with a satisfied grunt and presented his own nose for a pat. Modri obliged him, running his hands over the fine tan and brown scales behind the nostrils. She tests clean? He asked. Secret societies do tend to take drastic measures if they feel the need to do so, especially if they're being hunted as hard as the blades have been. Tilla chirped reassuringly and nibbled at his shirt. Modri drew in a long breath of the misty morning air and watched a flock of tikapa birds circling over the prairie, silvery feathers glinting in the sun. We're going to be called back to duty soon, I feel. It's been good to come back here, but we won't be able to stay for much longer. Will you two follow us back into the fray, or will we have to go it alone this time? Soluk growled and gave him an offended look, making him smile. Quite right, and forgive me. The pack must stay together. It's just that I feel that individuals must be allowed some choice in these matters. It doesn't do to allow others total control over what you do in life. I've tried that, and look what it got me. He extended his right arm, the wide scar cutting through the fur across the bicep where the new bone and muscle had been grafted on. Soluk sniffed at the scar and licked it gently. Modri nodded at the dragon. You have to make your own choices, or others will make them for you, and those choices are not necessarily good ones. I could very easily have wound up as a roe beast, or just dead. I'm not sure which is worse. Listen to my maundering. I'm in a mood this morning, aren't I? Tilla rumbled in amusement and laid her head in his lap, which effectively ended the conversation. Lizen found him a few hours later, reading silver bushes for the berries that they both liked. She had brushed out her fur and exchanged her Attenbach hides for her preferred trousers and tunic, but she still smelled like wild grasses and freedom. It was a fragrance that Modri found very attractive indeed. She still looked a bit weary around the eyes, and her movements were a little stiff, but that was only natural. My lady, he greeted her politely, handing her a fat pink berry. How is our guest? Still asleep, Lizen said, savoring the sweet fruit. She's been badly stressed for weeks now, and last night's exertions didn't do her any good. Espionage is not a profession that lends itself to long lifespans. Modri sighed. No, it isn't. I wonder if she might tell me anything of my great-uncle Xandrus. He disappeared years ago, perhaps into the Blades of Marmora. Oh, and the ship's keys. Lizen patted her pocket. I locked down the bridge, too. Sensible, Modri said. She'll want to talk to Keith. I wonder how they're doing. We haven't heard a word from any of them in some time. We'll find out soon enough, Lizen replied, letting her eyes drift over the yellow grasslands wistfully. She was always a little sad to leave this world. They're a busy team, you know. There is so very much for them to do, and they are moving so very fast. I'm astonished that we had the time to teach them as much as we did. We made time, them and us, and they've made good use of what we've given them. Modri dropped a few more berries into his bowl and stared at them thoughtfully for a moment. It's possible that we shouldn't have spent this last couple of weeks without access to the news nets. Lizen shook her head. A satellite would have been spotted instantly. I'm not opening this world up to attack. As it is, we'll have to clear out very soon. Our guest was being pursued, and her enemies may well decide to become ours as well if she wasn't successful in eluding them. She isn't sure. He humphed. Well, there are ways of dealing with that. Do you think that we'll have time for lunch? The kitchen has a recipe in its files for baked fruit tarts. Lizen chuckled and ran her thumb through the fine fur behind his ear. Not with those berries. They produce a rather fearsome toxin if exposed to high temperatures. I won't even go near them in midsummer because they split and fog the whole hill with lethal vapors. It's a good thing that it's still spring here, eh? Let us go and check up on our guest. The Blade was still out cold in the guest cabin and didn't stir when they looked in on her. Lizen could feel her heartbeat, slow and steady, as her body renewed itself. What did you give her? Modri asked very quietly. Lizen puffed a breath, steering him gently away from the cabin door. A hard run, a long fight, vital information, and Hantik tea. Quite a lot of Hantik, actually. You gave her the first really decent meal she's had in weeks and a safe place to sleep. She may be out for the rest of the day. I'll warm up the ship's sensors. If they were chasing her that hard, she may have something that they want, and it's best not to be here if they're that determined. Modri nodded. Find out where her ship is first and whether she armed it. If it's not too large or primed to blow, we can stick it in with the shuttles. Good idea, Lizen said, and headed for the bridge. Chimera Rising had an excellent sensor suite, and while it was quite able to scan nearby space for threats, it couldn't bring them more news than the fact that the near orbits were still empty, and that the Blade's ship was both small and movable. A single-person scout, fast, long-range and efficient, but terribly cramped, Modri thought to himself as he assembled the loading cradle around it. He was well aware that he was spoiled, of course. Lizen liked her comforts, and he was not going to dissuade her from them if he didn't have to. He made the last connection and activated the cradle, which hummed and lifted the little scout easily. Tilla and Soluk, who had never stolen a ship before, watched with interest. Modri nodded in satisfaction and beckoned to them. All right, your turn. All you need to do is get it moving and help me steer. In a proper shipyard, a craft like this would be moved by special drones. The dragons were quite equal in strength and a good deal brighter. They managed to get it into the Chimera's shuttle bay with only a few false starts and lashed it down with no further trouble. And when they rejoined Lizen in the stateroom, they found that the Blade had finally awoken. The woman still looked weary, but she was fully alert. The two women had been watching him and the dragons on the screens he saw, and he raised an inquisitive eyebrow at them. The Blade smiled thinly. My ship alerts me if it is disturbed. Lizen asked me not to allow it to kill you. Modri bowed slightly. I thank you for your consideration, my lady. Do we need to leave, Lizen? She nodded, indicating another screen. Someone's sniffing around the outer planets. I'd rather we were gone before he comes too close. I've already pulled in everything that I wanted to take with us. Tilla, Soluk, are you ready? The two dragons chirped agreeably. Modri, already packed and ready to go. Good. You two, get to the enviro deck. We lift in 3 minutes. The dragons turned and scrambled out, and the 3 Galra headed for the bridge. 3 minutes later, they were rising out and away from Zempidri and on course for Sech-la-Four, a burned-out little solar system at the back end of nowhere. There was nothing out there to interest anyone, save for those who desired privacy and access to the news nets without the likelihood of being spotted. Modri was quick to bring up the latest headlines, and what they saw startled them all. Ye gods, Lizen said, scanning through the articles. They have been busy, haven't they? Parzarek space hab stolen, Modri murmured, by a teledove ring, the biggest ever made. Moved right out into the middle of absolutely nowhere and later found severely damaged. Zarkon's also been severely damaged. Not dead, although whether that's propaganda or not, I don't know. Lizen glanced at the blade, who shrugged. Hagar's still alive, too, although she's lost most of her druids, and has sent for the prince. Oh, dear. My people were involved as well, the blade murmured, indicating an image taken from a security video, showing dark-clad figures spotted and striped with pale lights. The blades of Marmora have cast their lot in with the lions, as we had planned. Voltron took some damage too, Modri said darkly. The Black Lion had to be carried away by the others. Damn. Do you suppose... I'm not going to suppose anything until I talk to them, Lizen said sharply. There are too many variables. The princess may be down too if she was the one operating the transport ring. Teledove systems are too damned close to being magic for my comfort. Voltron itself has an etheric component in it, one that I can't see. Then we must speak with them, the blade said firmly. Can we do that from here? With ease and alacrity, Modri replied, taking something small and dark out of his pocket. Secure connection, too. If they're in range, they'll hear us. He pressed the button, eliciting a crackle of static, and then a faint voice that they had to strain to hear. Hello? They're right on the edge, Lizen murmured. Lance, is that you? Last I checked, yeah. Where have you guys been? It's been crazy out here. If the news nets are to be believed, it has indeed, Lizen said wryly. Where are you, and is everyone all right? Lance's voice took on a worried edge. Curran says that we're in the Ubentic system, hiding in the 3rd asteroid ring. The castle's in one piece, but Alura's got a lot on her mind, and so does Keith. We lost Shiro, and he stuck Keith with leading the team. Modri gasped. Dead? We don't know. I mean, we were doing great. Well, as great as anyone could against Zarkon. He had a really tough battlesuit, but we formed up into Voltron and managed to get a good stab in that broke it, but something in there short-circuited the Black Lion. When we opened up the cockpit, Shiro was gone. Not dead, just gone. I mean, not there at all. There could have even been a negative value of him or something, but we haven't got a clue about what happened in there, and the Black Lion's a little weird anyway. And look, do you think we could meet up somewhere soon? You're better at poofing out of sight than we are. Maybe he poofed out and didn't know how to poof back in. Does that happen? The boy sounded plaintive, nearly frantic. Lizen didn't like that at all. Rarely, and under very specific circumstances. Where is Keith? Out scouting around with Pidge and Hunk. The Galra forces are really stirred up right now, and we're having to lay low for a while. Why, did you find something else for us to do? No, dear, but we encountered his mother, Lizen replied. Ask Karan if he knows where the shells of Contis are. There was a gurgle of surprise from the other end. You found his mom? Like, his Galra mom? Look, we've only just gotten used to having the Marmorans in the house. Thanks for breaking us in, by the way. And they're still hanging around. Alura's getting really stressed because Hagar's an Altean, and they aren't supposed to go around being horrifically evil all the time. And an Altean? It was Lizen's turn to be surprised. That is interesting. Karan, if you can hear me over Lance's blithering, can you get to the shells? There was a squawk and the faint sound of a scuffle on the other end, and then Karan's voice came through. Yes, we can, if we move carefully. Thankfully, the blades are willing to follow along. Grand chap's really very good to fight.
We can get there in maybe 4 or 5 days or so. We're a very long way out. The battle with the druids took a lot out of Allura.
Lazen sighed. Don't push her. It'll take us nearly that long to get there as well. We've been up to shenanigans of our own, if I'm using that word right, and we would rather not be found. Keith's mother is with us, and she was being pursued as well. I'm fairly sure that we've confused them, but better safe than sorry.
Take your time. As you might imagine, we've got worries of our own. Did you ever manage to get a look at Prince... what was his name? Lotor?
Yes, if only from a distance. He's a bit of a romantic in spots, but is going to be trouble. The fact that his father's been laid flat will either make him or break him, and either way, Hagar will not permit failure. Have strength, Karan. And when you arrive at the shells, look for the greenest one on the scans. You'll see what I mean when you get there. Chimera out.
If you say so. Castle out.
Modri leaned back in his seat and glanced at the blade, who was looking a little disappointed. A double reunion, he murmured. It'll be efficient, at least. The blade growled low in her throat. Perhaps. Our leader will want to have a word with me about certain of my actions, but I will not be separated from my son again. Contus was a very unusual solar system. It had 2 stars that were more or less the same size, but it had no planets at all. What it had instead was an enormous cloud of broken stone bubbles, each one the size of a small moon. It was far too dangerous for any sort of colonization, and only barely feasible ground for the most reckless of rare mineral prospectors. The reason for that was readily apparent when the Chimera Rising arrived. By the gods, Morthry breathed in wonder. Is that what I think it is? Lazen nodded. A weblum, spawning. This is one of their hatcheries. She's nearly finished. It was an old one, thousands of miles long in a deep iridescent green along the belly, which pulsed steadily as egg after moon-sized egg was ejected into orbit. I stumbled onto this system while trying to avoid a pirate hunter, Lazen said nostalgically. Damned near got eaten by a hatching weblum while I was at it, although it took care of my pursuit quickly enough. I stayed just long enough to find a real treasure. Here, she tapped the controls, bringing up a full-spectrum scan of the crowded system. It looked like a vast spherical swarm of frozen bubbles and a multitude of soft colors. Right along the outer edge of that swarm, however, nearly at the southern pole, was one that was just a little greener than anything else around it. That's our target. What's so special about it? The blade murmured, her topaz eyes scanning the bubble swarm thoughtfully, probably filing this place away for future use in her mind. Lazen's hands danced over the controls, taking them toward that one green sphere. Every once in a while, a weblum egg doesn't hatch. It's rare, but it happens. The worm that laid that particular egg had been eating a planet that contained a very great deal of boron, silicon, and other crystalloids, and not much in the way of metals. That weakened the shell of this egg enough for the embryo to die. See the cracking? They had come close enough now to the great greenish sphere to see the huge fissures in the otherwise smooth surface. Lazen followed one enormous rift down to where a tremendous triangular section had fallen away into the void and slipped in through that opening. They flew down a long tunnel into a vast open space, and her passengers gasped in wonder as the ship's bright lights lit up an emerald wonderland of crystal formations the size of cities. Dimly visible in the center was a spiky, whorled knot of something dark and cold. This is amazing, Modri whispered. And the weblums have left it alone? Weblums won't eat their own kind, Lazen said, parking them at a safe distance from the larger crystals. Not even the hatchlings will bother a dead egg, although they'll grudgingly graze on each other's eggshells. Sooner or later, this system will form up some planets using all of this debris, but it's in no hurry to do so. We're safe enough for now. That sentiment was not shared by the occupants of the Castle of Lions. How are we supposed to find them in that mess? Allura asked, staring in amazement at the silicoid froth clustered around the binary star.
And which one's the green one? Hunk asked. Not sure. She didn't say, Coran said, setting up a series of system scans. Just that it would show up the greenest on the scans. Hold on, running those.
There, Pidge said a moment later. Look at the southern hemisphere, right down at the bottom on the visible light spectrum scan. It's practically glowing. There was a rumble from the blade of Marmora, who had been standing as unobtrusively as he could off to one side. Kolovan's presence had become necessary at one of the Marmoran bases, so he had left one of his best lieutenants and a squad of blades to serve in the castle as a sort of household guard, with the promise that he and his warriors would be polite and discreet at all times. The big fellow was surprisingly good at that, despite being nearly 8 feet tall and built like a tank. When he spoke, people heard his voice with their bones more than with their ears. It is glowing. That is not natural. What is this place?
Weblum spawning ground, Coran replied, scanning around for danger. There were 6 or 7 places like this known to astrogators in my time, probably a bit more. They aren't hard to discover, it's just that the discoverers have to live long enough to tell other people about it. That's the tricky bit, you know.
Yes, the blade observed, and lifted a finger to point at something on the screen. You will want to keep that in mind. The Weblum is still here.
Coran yelped and tapped furiously at the controls, barely keeping the ship out of the visual range of the titanic worm-like creature lurking nearly invisibly among the eggshells to the left. Fortunately, the great beast wasn't interested in them. Having just laid a large clutch of eggs, it seemed to be taking a nap.
Whoa, Hunk breathed. It's even bigger than the one Keith and I had to deal with. A lot bigger. I bet that this one can shoot a beam that'd slice a planet in half.
Yeah, pretty much, Coran said, staying very carefully out of the beast's sight.
She's a big old girl and no mistake. I'd say, yes, she'd have to be the biggest on record.
She was probably nibbling moons before King Alfor was born. They don't die of old age, as far as anyone knows.
Organosilicoid life form? Pidge asked, sounding interested.
Mostly silicoid, Coran replied. That's as much as anyone was able to find out. Nobody's ever managed to find a dead one, see, or build a lab big enough to study one in. Studying the live ones is a bit too dangerous for most folks. There we are, that's the globe we want. Bright green.
It certainly was. It shone like a sphere of emerald in the shadows, and even Keith, who had been brooding silently in his defense drone station, had to sit up and take notice. Wow.
I'm getting a drive trace, Coran said, bringing the spectra up on the screens. It's them. They're around here somewhere. No. They're inside that thing. How'd they do that?
There, that crack, Allura answered him. See the little chip where it branches? That has to be it.
Good guess, Coran said. It's even big enough to admit us, and with plenty of room to spare. What a lovely place to hide.
It certainly was, although the sight of the vast verdant crystal formations within prompted Lance to snicker and then to sing, We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Shut up, Lance, Pidge said. And she's a witch, not a wizard.
Hunk groaned.
Oh, now you've done it. Now I've got this picture in my head of her in a pointy hat and stripy socks and the ruby slippers, which doesn't work at all because she hardly ever wore shoes anyway, and she had those 2 big claws per foot.
Shut up, Hunk, Keith groaned, visions on broomsticks already assailing his own imagination.
Hunk wasn't listening. And anyway, the movie's got a lot of stuff wrong. I had to read my little sister the whole series of the original books once, and Lizen would have gotten bored with Oz after 2 days, picked a fight with Glinda and knocked over the Emerald City, then zapped the Witch of the West and Ozma into oblivion, teamed up with the flying monkeys, gnomes, and whalers, and taken the whole place over.
Hunk, Keith protested.
You can just see her doing it, can't you? Hunk insisted. They were all pretty dumb over there anyway.
Pidge bounced a wadded-up piece of notepaper off of his head. The blade had watched this entire exchange with a baffled expression on his scarred face. What are they talking about? Some work of fiction or other, Allura said wearily, casting an exasperated glance at her paladins. Having them as part of the Alliance will be interesting, to say the least. Yes, the blade said, although he sounded a bit dubious as to the wisdom of that inclusion. We will wish to speak with the witch. The Blade of Marmora can always use locations such as this that do not invite company. Perhaps she knows of more.
You'll have to wait your turn, Allura told him. We all have questions for her. They found the Chimera rising with no trouble, it being the only source of light within the green globe, and once the castle had established a stable docking position, the lights went out, plunging the sphere into darkness. This was only prudent. There was no point in making it easy for any uninvited guests. Despite this, a tunnel was run between the Chimera's main hatch and the castle, and the visitors invited to come aboard. Keith was a bag of nerves, although he tried to hide it. His mother was coming, along with possible answers to a whole lot of pressing problems. It was almost a relief when the tunnel doors slid open to allow, the dragons in first. Tilla and Soluk were very happy to see everyone again, and Keith soon found himself being whiffled and licked with enthusiasm, which is a bit overwhelming when it's coming from something as big as a prairie dragon. Sorry about that, they insisted on going first. A very welcome voice spoke up over the gronking sounds the dragons were making, and the laughter of those receiving their attentions. I don't argue right of way with these big louts. Lizen had come out of the tunnel, followed by Modri and a tall Galra woman in a Marmoran uniform that he recognized instantly. That face had been haunting his dreams for weeks now. She looked around warily at those assembled. Keith pushed Soluk's head away and would have gone to meet her, but the big blade, Bantax, Keith thought his name was, approached her first, or tried to. He'd only gone 2 strides before Tilla got in the way and started sniffing at him. Bantax, surprised, stood rigidly while she did so, and everyone went quiet when she hissed. Bantax jerked away, but not fast enough to keep her from catching his arm between her teeth. She didn't bite down, not quite, but he was forced to stand still while Soluk sniffed at his back. Soluk focused on a spot just under the left shoulder blade and growled like a thunderstorm. Lizen was on it immediately. Ah, she said, laying a hand over that spot. Took part in that fight with the druids, did you? Bantax grunted, trying to pull his arm out of Tilla's grip and failing. Yes, I caught a glancing blow. There was no wound. Lizen nodded. No, but it did lay a hex on you. Been feeling a little odd, hearing voices, getting odd urges. He gave her a surprised look. Bad dreams, and moments of despair. I have been resisting them. Yes, and quite successfully. I hope you find a lady of your own one day, Lizen told him. Can't let your traits go to waste. Brace yourself, this is going to hurt. She chanted a few soft words before yanking her hand away from his back, much as one would when pulling a burr off of one's clothing. Bantax didn't quite scream, although he went pale under his fur and wheezed a harsh breath. When Lizen opened her hand, she showed them a spitting, jagged shard of livid purple light, englobed in a filmy sphere of gold. You're lucky that it didn't have more time to build on this, she told the gasping blade. This is a compulsion, which could have driven you quite mad. Does he have any more on him, Soluk? Soluk gave Bantax another thorough sniffing. Thankfully, he sneezed and giggled. Tilla let go of him and licked his face gently in apology. Consider yourself lucky, Blade, Mothri said, watching in grim satisfaction as Lizen crushed the bit of bad magic out of existence. I had 3 fully formed ones in my mind alone, and more in what was left of my body. Bantax stared at him for a long moment, and then at Lizen, and at the dragons. He dipped a shallow bow in their direction with a faint, pained smile and said, We shall have to have a long talk soon. There are a great many things that we would like to learn from you. I will be delighted to teach you all sorts of things, sir, but right now there are other things to discuss. First and foremost, she jabbed a finger in Keith's direction. You need to acquaint yourself with your mother, and she with you. Find a quiet corner and do that now before something stupid happens. Don't object, Sir Blade. It might have been a year or 2 since you've seen her, but he's waited all of his life. Wait your turn. Everybody else will come up to the lounge where we may at least be comfortable. Allura, what the hell has been going on around here? Hunk smiled happily. It's great to have you back, scary space ant. Lizen smirked back. It's great to be back, delightful space nephew. Now, shoo, all of you. Keith had the interesting view of 3 humans, 2 Alteans, 2 Galramen, one of whom could bench press a hippo, and 2 dragons, either one of whom could eat a hippo, all of whom were trying to talk at once, being herded into the lift by one slim female. Privately, he wondered if Zarkon had made himself emperor in an attempt to not get bullied by his own ants all the time. There was a faint sigh behind him and a soft-voiced, "Keith." He turned and looked at the stranger in dark clothing, who was gazing at him with a sort of hungry wistfulness. They just stood there for a few minutes in awkward silence, unsure of what to say. Finally, the Galra woman murmured, "You look so much like your father." "How did it happen, Mom?" Keith asked quietly. "Why did you come to Earth? Why did you leave?" She smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I should ask you if you have the right to that information. You had my knife when I saw you last. Have you earned the right to keep it?" Keith gritted his teeth, throttling down on a rush of anger. "Not human," he reminded himself, "and a blade of Marmora as well. Knowledge or death?" "I have. They put me through hell to get it." She nodded. "It must be that way. You may hate them for it. I do." "I'll hate Zarkon instead, who made things that bad for them," Keith growled. "What happened?" "We were searching for the lions," she said simply. "We had been searching for them for centuries, for if we could find them, we could keep them from the Emperor, perhaps even presenting some of our own as paladins. We knew that Alfor had hidden them all over the most remote reaches of the universe. We didn't know where, and Alfor had taken that knowledge with him when he died. I was one of the searchers. I found one, although not in the way that I had hoped." "The blue one," Keith breathed. "Why didn't you call home?" "Zarkon's forces were searching as well, and they knew of our own attempts. One of their scouts pursued me as I was scanning that small red planet. I eluded him, but not before he had damaged my ship. I managed to land my craft on Earth, but not well. The ship was destroyed. Very nearly, so was I. Your father found me and took me back to his home." Keith suddenly felt a pang of homesickness stab through him, keen as the blade he wore on his belt. An image of the shabby cabin, with its cracking plaster and sagging furniture, flashed before his eyes. Here he was, surrounded by technology and comforts beyond the imagining of most of the rest of his race, and he would have given up almost anything to flop down on his own couch again. "He treated my wounds as best he could, fed me and gave me time to recover," his mother murmured softly. "I was less than polite at first, but he showed great patience and gave me someone to argue with. Later, when I was able to walk long distances again, he took me to the crash site. There was nothing there that I could use. It took me 2 years to make even a short-range communicator from the available technology at that time. I was marooned forever on that primitive planet, or so I'd thought." "I'm sorry," Keith muttered. "I wasn't." He heard her low chuckle and was surprised to see a rather naughty smile on her face. "Your father was handsome and strong and kind. I had despaired of finding anyone like him long since. If I was going to be stuck on an alien world for the rest of my life, then by all the gods I was going to enjoy it." Keith blushed hotly, and he ran one hand through his hair. Did you, the thing with the ears?" She laughed. "Oddly, yes, and he responded, although not to the extent that Galra men do. We learned to compromise. We also went exploring and found the Lion's Cave. The inscriptions, although they did not come alive for us, were unmistakable. What an irony, I had thought, and it became our secret. It would have done your people no good at all to know of it, not with the Imperial patrols sniffing around. I was pregnant with you when my makeshift comm started picking up radio chatter that did not come from Earth." Keith swallowed hard. "Dad never talked about you. I don't think he ever really forgave you for leaving." "I had no choice," his mother whispered. I stayed until you were weaned, but could stay no longer. The patrol ships were already sending down scouts to search. I caught one and took his ship. The Blades of Marmora had to know. You must understand why."
"I do." Keith drew in a shuddering breath. "But you could have come back. You could have taken Dad and me away with you." She was shaking her head. "I could not risk it. During the time that I had spent on Earth, 2 of our bases had been discovered and destroyed. We lost over a quarter of our number. We had no room, no time, and no energy to spare to look after an untrained alien and a baby. You were safer on Earth than I could have made you anywhere else. I had always intended to come back, Keith, but the time was never right. In the end, the lion did it for me." Keith nodded, remembering the events of the past year. It had been a very long, very strange trip. She drifted forward, her arms reaching out to him. "I had never dreamed that it would be my son who would find the Red Lion, much less be accepted as Paladin. I had not dared to dream of anything for you at all. I had hoped that you would live in safety when I dared to hope for anything. And now you are leader." Keith groaned and flung himself into her embrace. She held him close, going down on one knee to wrap her long arms around his shoulders. "I don't want to be leader, Mom," he rasped, burying his face in her shoulder. "That's Shiro's job, and now he's gone. He was like my big brother, and he was a lot better at it than I am." She rested her face against his hair, breathing deep of his scent. "None of us are good as we would wish to be. I am still proud of you, my Keith. I am proud of you for who you are and what you have done. I am proud of what you are going to do, whatever that may be. I failed you, and for that I may never forgive myself. I have found you now, and no one will ever change that." Keith sniffled. "Don't say that, Mom. Every time a long-lost relative says that, they wind up dead a little while later." His mother snorted. "Ah, yes. I spent a great deal of time watching that sort of thing on television while living with your father. Garbage, child. I am not a human. I am a Galra, and a very highly trained warrior at that. If anyone tries to come between us again, I will kill them and make you a gift of their skulls." Keith chuckled damply. "No thanks. I've got too much stuff on my shelf already. I'll settle for having my own space ninja mom instead." "I'll keep the skulls, then," she said, squeezing him gently. "Tell me, then, if you can bear to, what happened to you and your father after I left?" Keith wiped at his face with one sleeve. "There's not much to tell. Dad did his best, but he never really did all that well. I got through elementary school all right, but when I was 7, I woke up one morning and he didn't. The coroner said that he'd had a heart condition. Uncle Jake took me in, but he was military, and they kept sending him away on missions. They eventually sent him on one that he didn't come back from. I sort of grew up on the army base. That was where I'd met Shiro, actually. The sergeants kept sticking him with babysitting me. He and Uncle Jake got me a scholarship in the Galaxy Garrison Academy because I tested well in flight sims. I was pretty good at it, but I tended to talk back to the instructors a lot. Eventually I got wrapped up in a project that they didn't assign to me, so I finally got expelled when I told them to screw off once too often. They didn't like it when I called bullshit on their calling the failure of the Kerberos mission pilot error. Shiro didn't make mistakes. "What project?" his mother asked. "Finding the lion. I could hear it calling, even though it was Lance's, not mine." Keith looked up at her curiously. "Maybe it noticed you and Dad when you found its cave. Neither of you were quite right, but together?" She huffed thoughtfully, stroking his hair. "It is possible. I was pregnant when we found it. No one knows exactly how much of an influence those things have on their surroundings, or how much they perceive. Perhaps Lizen might tell us more." "Yeah. I need you to tell me one more thing, Mom," he said, looking a little ashamed. "Dad never told me your name." She stared at him in surprise, her expression growing pained. "I should not have left him. Ah, gods, but I had no choice. I am Cyan, Keith." "Like the Queen of Namtora that Lizen told us about?"
Cyan smiled.
I was named after her. It's not uncommon on Namtura, where I was born. Perhaps one day I will take you there to meet my side of the family.
That'd be nice, Keith said.
How about we go upstairs and join the others?
Cyan nodded and flowed to her feet.
I think that would be a good idea.